Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Be Like Christ for our John chapter 5 Bible study. I want to welcome everybody in. If you're new here, there's free notes down in the description below. There's also a free ebook you can grab. If you have the notes are a good thing to have today. There's a couple pictures in there that will help kind of bring the story to life a little bit. So make sure to grab those. I know I said I was going to do everything in one video, but we're going to do chapter 5 and 2, and I'm not even gonna lie to you and say we're going to do chapter 6 in one video, because there's like 70 verses. So probably going to do some two-parters. I know, fail, but oh well. At least we're going to get through it. So chapter 5, we are going to talk about verses 1 through 18. We have a interaction with Jesus and a man who needs healing, and also the Jewish people who take issue with the healing. And then in the second half of the chapter, we have a lot of discourse from Jesus, a lot of red letters there. So that's why I decided to split it in two, because a lot of that discussion that Jesus, teaching or preaching of Jesus, often takes a little bit more time to get into and unpack. So let's deal with the first 18 verses here. It might have a little bit of a shorter video. Okay, John chapter 5, verse 1. This is coming on the heels of John chapter 4, which was the woman at the well, the living water, being born again. And then at the end of chapter 4 was the healing of the nobleman, or the official's son, from Capernaum while Jesus was in Cana. Okay, so here's verse 1 of chapter 5. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Between chapters 4 and 5, there's probably a significant amount of time, because at the end of chapter 4, Jesus is going up from Samaria, up from the south to the north to Galilee. And here, at the very beginning of chapter 5, we find him going in the exact opposite direction. He's going back down to Jerusalem. So probably a good section of time here. John is not trying to present every detail of Jesus' life in exact chronological order. He's hitting the highlights that he wants to prove his point, that Jesus is the Messiah. So Jesus is headed down to Jerusalem. Now verses 2 through 5. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. I was reading this, and being somebody who was raised on the King James Version and used the King James Version even as I grew up for several years, I noticed, I was like, wait, so isn't something missing here? And there's a very interesting story here about an angel and what's going on here. So now let me read this same section in the King James Version. I was reading out of the English Standard. Here's the King James. And if you have the notes, I've put the part that is different in bold. Here we go, verse 3. In these lay a great multitude of impotent folk, of blind, halt, withered, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the water. Whosoever then first, after the troubling of the water, stepped in, was made whole of whatever disease he had. And a certain man was there, which had an infirmity 38 years. So I was reading the English Standard. I was like, wait, where's the part about the angel? Because that's a really curious part if you're familiar with the King James Version. And actually, part of verse 3 and verse 4 has been taken out of the English Standard Version. You'll notice in the English Standard, it just skips from verses 3 to verse 5. Sometimes those are actually pretty hard to catch. You're not always looking at the verse numbers. But why is that? Well, this is not a class on textual criticism, and in an effort to make these videos somewhat reasonably long, we are not going to go into all of the details about why that's been removed. We've come across some verses like this in the past, but since the time of the King James Version, when it was published in 1611, there have been some older manuscripts found, some copies of the Bible, some older ones, and those older copies do not have this little chunk of John in them. So a lot of people think that maybe a scribe or somebody somebody who was doing this copying inserted this section about the angel as a point of clarification for why all these people were waiting around the pool, and why the man says what he says in the upcoming verses to Jesus. So there's some debate about that. We're not going to get into, necessarily which translation is correct. I kind of like this story because it's curious and it's unique in the Bible, and I grew up reading it. But just know that's the reason for the difference. Now, the text talks about a sheep gate. So the sheep gate was on the east side of Jerusalem. I have a map of Jerusalem there in your notes. You'll see that this would have been a natural entry point for anyone who was arriving from the north, or maybe was arriving from the Mount of Olives or Bethany, which we know Jesus spent some time in and often traveled from there to Jerusalem. So this is probably a gate that he used quite a bit. It says there were 5 colonnades around this pool. A colonnade is a row of columns that supports a roof. Think like Roman times, which makes sense because that's where we are here in history. But I got a picture there of a colonnade also in your notes, which will be helpful. So in these colonnades, or under them, probably sitting underneath of them in the open air, in the shade, protecting themselves from the sun and from rain, were a bunch of sick and handicapped people. And this was a place where they congregated seemingly long term. And one of these men had been handicapped for 38 years. Now verses 6 through 8. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" And the sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me." And Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." Without the story about the angel, you can see how the man's response to Jesus would be a little bit confusing. So that's kind of part of the discussion of what we just talked about. Jesus walks up to this handicapped man, and he asks him if he wants to be healed. And, obviously the answer is yes, I definitely would like to be healed. But he then proceeds to tell Jesus why he couldn't be healed. He didn't have anyone to get him into the water when it was troubled by the angel. Someone always got there first, and seemingly it was first come, first serve, and no one else got healed after the first person. Jesus tells the man then, "Rise, take up your bed, and walk." And verse 9 tells us that that's exactly what he did. I thought there's some application here, some parallels between what happened to the salvation of Christians and the healing and the salvation of this man from his paralysis. Here was a sick man who wanted to be healed, but he didn't have the ability. Human beings, in general, are all sick. Some of them have a desire to be healed, but the problem is they don't have the ability to be healed. That's kind of the discussion it's kind of the discussion of Romans chapter 7, where Paul is talking, and he says that he desires to be holy and righteous before God, but he can't be because his flesh, his desires are always pulling against him, and he's a sinner, and he's been separated from God because of his sins. And then in the end of the chapter 7, he says, "But Jesus came and solved my problem." And what needed or needs to happen in the man's case here and in the sinner's case is that Jesus has to come along and solve the problem that you can't solve, that you don't have the ability to complete. In the man's case, that was to heal him miraculously. In our case, that's to heal us of our sin guilt by paying the price for us on the cross. And Paul concludes Romans 7, "Thanks be unto God for his gift of Jesus Christ," and then opens up chapter 8 saying, "There's no condemnation now for those who are in Christ." Verses 9 and 10. "And immediately the man was made whole and took up his bed and walked. And on the same day was the Sabbath." That's important. Remember that. "The Jews therefore said unto him that was cured, It is the Sabbath day. It is not lawful for thee to carry thy bed." Jesus' words in a moment rebuilt this man's muscles, his bones, calibrated all of his balance that he hadn't used in 38 years. You got to think about all those details when you think about how amazing a miracle like this would have been. It's much more than a scientific wonder. It's miraculous. And to do all of that in a split second. There's no rehab. There's no, it all works perfectly in a moment, right? It's incredible. And as Jesus commanded, the man got up. He bent down, picked up his bed, which was probably more of a mat that he was lying on, some kind of thing to make the ground a little bit softer, not like a mattress like we would think about today. But he picks up his bed and he walks away. But as all good deeds often are, or as with all good deeds, somebody takes an issue with it, right? Somebody has a problem. It was the Sabbath day. And on Sabbath, the Jews were not supposed to do any kind of work. If you're not, you might be familiar with the Old Testament, you might not be. In the Old Testament, the Jews were told that they were not supposed to work on Sabbath or Shabbat, or it would be our Saturday. They weren't supposed to do any kind of work, and there were prohibitions for what they could do on that day because it was supposed to be a day of rest. It kind of paralleled the during the creation account. God rested the seventh day. And he gave a principle to the Jews that they were supposed to rest on the seventh day. In Exodus chapter 31, verses 12 through 17, this is what the Lord said to Moses. You are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. You shall keep the Sabbath, because it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does any work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath shall be put to death. Therefore, the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbaths, observing the Sabbaths throughout their generation as a covenant forever. It is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. So this was serious business. Anybody who did any work on the Sabbath day was to be killed. So not messing around here. This is a big deal. And to profane the Sabbath or to disrespect it was not something that was taken lightly. And that's now what they are accusing this man of, who's just been healed and is now carrying his bed. Just a little history about the Sabbath. We know from the Gospels that, and from the Old Testament, that there were God-given rules for the Sabbath day, but there had been a lot of traditions that had sprung up around the Sabbath day that were not God-given, they were man-created. And Jesus is often in conflict with these traditions. Some of these are recorded in the Jewish Talmud, which was a document it recorded these traditions from the Jews, these oral traditions. And the Talmud mentions 39 things that the rabbis forbid on the Sabbath day. And just keep this in mind, that these 39 things come out of the traditions of the Jews. They're traditions, and they may or may not be or accurately reflect God's laws. Okay, so just keep that in mind. These can be found in the first tractate, kind of like a chapter, called the Order of Appointment in the Talmud. So here's a list of the 39 things that you are not supposed to do according to the traditions of the rabbis. Carrying, burning, extinguishing, finishing, writing, erasing, cooking, washing, sewing, tearing, knotting, untying, shaping, plowing, planting, reaping, harvesting, threshing, winnowing, selecting, sifting, grinding, kneading, combining, spinning, dyeing, chain stitching, warping, weaving, unraveling, building, demolishing, trapping, shearing, slaughtering, skinning, tanning, smoothing, and marking. There's a lot of inging in there, a lot of verbs going on. So I actually got this off of an Orthodox Jew website. So I'm not just, pulling this off of some Christian website that's misinterpreting the law. This came off of an Orthodox Jews website. Now, I know there are differences in beliefs in the Jews as well, but this will give you an idea of some of the traditions that were around. So now, when you put all those together, you kind of find out pretty quickly that almost anything could fall under any of those, or almost anything could be forbidden based on those restrictions. It kind of depended on your interpretation and how strict you were on those things. And that was part of the problem that Jesus had with the Pharisees, is that they just kind of created whatever they wanted and made some of they blew some of these out of the original intention that God had for the Sabbath laws. And I hope that made some sense. But they went beyond God's laws and created their own traditions. That's what I was trying to say. Now, for a man carrying his bed, one verse that they probably went to was a verse like Jeremiah chapter 17, verses 21 and 22. Jeremiah was one of the prophets in the Old Testament, and he said, "Thus says the Lord, take care for the sake of your lives, and do not bear a burden on the Sabbath day, or bring it in by the gates of Jerusalem. And do not carry a burden out of your house on the Sabbath day, or do any work, but keep the Sabbath day holy, as I commanded your fathers." That's what Jeremiah said. The rabbis would have known that section of Scripture, and they probably looked at this man. They're like, look, he's bearing a burden. He's carrying his bed right now, and that's a violation of the Sabbath. The question is, was it a violation of the Sabbath? Even today, there's a lot of debate as to whether or not Jesus telling this man to carry his bed was contradictory. I don't want to use that word. Was to give an exception to the law of Moses, or did carrying your bed fall under the genuine intent of the law of Moses? So let me clarify. There's a debate even today as to whether this was a violation of the law, or if it was within the authorization of the law. Can't find the right words. Some people say that Jesus commanding this man to take up his bed was, in fact, contrary to the law of Moses. Some say it wasn't, and the intention behind a verse like Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 21 and 22, and the way that the term burden is used there is not applicable in this context, right? So I've heard some arguments on both sides. Some people make some good points on both sides. And the question is, well, which is it? What I want to do is, rather than delve into all of the details of those arguments, I want to give you the principle that I think is most important for us to take away from this situation and this encounter of Jesus and this situation in light of the Old Testament law. And here's the principle that I think is most important. Moses, nor the written law God used him to communicate, were the ultimate Jewish authority. God, who had given the law, was the ultimate Jewish authority. He was the lawgiver. And if God, who created the Old Testament law, told you or told me that it was okay to carry my bed on the Sabbath day, then it was okay to carry your bed on the Sabbath day, right? In our Gospel of Matthew study, we looked at one of the verses, I think it was in chapter 12. Might have been chapter 14, I can't remember, where Jesus makes a statement about himself, and he says, "For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." And that he says that he has permission to speak on what is authorized on the Sabbath day and what is not authorized on the Sabbath day. Jesus, as God, established the Sabbath. And if he wished to grant an exception of Sabbath for this man to carry his bed, it was fully within his authority to do so. I don't think that's in any way contradictory to the Scriptures. And obviously, God is the lawgiver. If he wants to give an exception, he can give an exception. And I don't see why that would be wrong in any way. So I think that's the most important thing to take away from this text. You can argue about whether it was a violation of the law forever or not. But at the end of the day, Jesus was the lawgiver. So if he decided that this man was allowed to carry his bed, then he was allowed to carry his bed. I'd be interested to hear if you have any thoughts on that. But I think that's really, if we recognize that, we don't have a problem with this text. And I think that is a point that is rightfully recognized, that is true. Jesus has the ability to make exceptions if he wants to make exceptions. And if there was no exception needed and that was within the purview of the law, then we have no problem either. So, okay, verses 11 through 13. But he answered them, "The man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.' And they asked him, 'Who is the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk?' Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place." The Jews come up to this man. They're like, "What are you doing? It's the Sabbath day. You can't carry your bed." And the man answers back to them, "Well, the one who healed me, he told me that I could take up my bed and walk." And I think the answer of the Jews here in verse 12 is curious, and it's telling of who they were and what they really cared about. Notice what they asked. This man has just said, he says, "A man healed me, and then he told me to take up my bed and walk." What did the Jews ask about? The Jews say, "Who is the man who told you to break the Sabbath day?" That's my paraphrase, but who's the man who told you to take up your bed and walk? That's a violation of the Sabbath day law. They cared more about policing the law than they cared about knowing a man who possessed the power of the lawgiver. Do you recognize that? They're like, "Whoa, wait a second. How did you get healed? We need to talk to this man. We need to figure out who he is." They want to know, who told you to break the law? In the face of a miracle, you see where their attention and priorities lie. They couldn't recognize the God that they claimed to serve even when he was walking around in their own neighborhoods. And there's a lot of people, or a lot of times in the Gospels, when Jesus showed the religious leaders that their ignorance of their God prevented them from interpreting their law correctly, God's law correctly. That they would get all down in the minutia of the law, arguing about the finest points of doctrine, but in reality, their view was so micro, and they lacked a macro perspective that they couldn't understand the small things because they didn't even know the God that they were serving. Does that happen today in the church? I think by a point of application there is, yeah, that definitely happens in the church today. People can sit around and debate tiny points of doctrine all the time, but really in reality, they don't even know the God and the character and his nature and who he is in order to be able to interpret those finer points as they should. So their priority is in the wrong place. The Jews got so buried down in the minutia of the Old Testament law that they missed the forest for the trees. And they were supposed to be looking for a Messiah, but when he actually showed up with all of the signs that he needed to prove his identity, like the healing of the man, all they wanted to do was kill him. And they had made their interpretation of the law their God, rather than making God their God. And they had nothing to learn, not even from a miracle worker. And anything that contradicted their interpretation was immediately ruled out as heretical and wasn't even worth considering. That attitude definitely exists even in the church sometimes today, is the idea that, I know what I know, and if you tell me something that I don't already know, then you must be a heretic. Not necessarily true, as we find out here from the Jews. The man who had been healed couldn't answer the Jews' question. They're like, "Who healed you?" And he says, I don't know. The reason was because Jesus didn't stick around. He left because of the crowd. It says that he had withdrawn. So there's kind of this mystery that's taking place for a while. And then verse 14. Afterwards, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." Jesus finds the man a little bit later And he says this interesting statement to him. You are well, sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. How do we interpret that statement? What is Jesus saying? What is he intending to communicate to this man? Should we conclude that all sickness and disability are the result of some sin or error of our past, or maybe our ancestors' past or something? Is that what Jesus is saying to him? I think the answer to that is no. If this was the only verse that we had in the Bible on this topic, we might conclude yes, but it's not. If we go a little bit further into the Gospel of John, in John chapter 9, Jesus meets a blind man, and his apostles ask him a very curious question that relates to this passage. They say, who sinned? Did this man sin, or did his parents sin that he was born blind? And Jesus tells him, neither. That's not the problem. That's not why this man is blind. He actually says that he's blind so that God might be glorified. So no, we should not conclude that all sickness and disability is a result of some sin of our past. In light of John 9 and other biblical passages, I can think of two ways that we can interpret this text. We've already kind of ruled out that first one, but how do we interpret this text then? I think two ways. Here's one. We could view it as a specific statement made into this man's specific circumstances. What do I mean? His handicap may have come as a result of him indulging in some sin 38 years ago, right? That's very possible. We know that that can happen. If you're drunk and you get in a car and you go and get in a wreck on the highway, you can have some serious physical consequences that come as a result of your sin. Sin can lead to terrible things. It doesn't always lead to terrible things. And not all terrible things are the result of sin, but there are specific instances where they are very much connected. And that could be what Jesus is saying here. Maybe this man's lameness, handicappedness, came because of some sin in his past. And Jesus is saying, don't do it again. Don't live for sin anymore. I've given you new health. Go out and live for God and live a better life. That's view number one. And view number two could be that this is just Jesus giving a general warning about living a life to avoid a life of sin, right? This man kind of has a new life ahead of him. He can walk now, and he could never walk before. He can do all kinds of things that he can't do, or that he couldn't do before. And Jesus could be just generally making a statement: don't go out and live for sin. To paraphrase, maybe the intention behind Jesus' statement might go something like, if you thought 38 years of being a handicap was bad, the consequences of living in sin are worse. And so don't waste the new health that you've been given and end up in a worse position in the end, end up in hell, because 38 years lying on your side is going to be nothing compared to that. So it could just be a general warning against a life of sin. Put those two interpretations out there. I don't know that I favor one over the other necessarily, but I'll give those for your mind to mull over. And maybe you can think of some others. Verse 15 and 16 now. The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing things on the Sabbath day. Now that Jesus has revealed himself to this man, the man goes and he tells the Jews who it was who has healed him. And this made the Jews very angry, and they persecuted Jesus because the text says he was doing things on the Sabbath day, or he was working on the Sabbath day. Was Jesus working on the Sabbath day, or was that just their interpretation? Well, I think we're going to find out in a few verses here that Jesus claims to be working on the Sabbath day. So there's not really any confusion there. Jesus blatantly rejected, not only in this text, but in other texts, their traditions about what it meant to work on the Sabbath day. And he rejected their attempts to tell him that he couldn't work on the Sabbath day. There was a sense in which the Sabbath day was, there was a sense in which the Sabbath law, which was designed for men, didn't apply to Christ. And we're going to see that in a few verses here. Verse 17 and 18 now, these are the last two verses. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Jesus turns to the Jews and he says, "My Father is working and I am working. You're accusing me of working on the Sabbath. You're right. I am working on the Sabbath day, just like my Father." Well, who's his Father? Who's he talking about there? There's no question that that's God, the Father. God doesn't rest on the Sabbath day. He gave an example of rest in the seventh day for our benefit, not because he needed a day off. And, the world doesn't stop working on Saturday, or didn't stop working on Saturday because God, took a day off and the planets fell out of orbit and things like that. No, that didn't happen. Prayers didn't get backed up in the queue on Saturday because God didn't go back to work until Sunday. God worked on the Sabbath day, and he alone is the only one who had the authority to do that. The Jews, no Jew was accepted from the Sabbath laws, but God was working on the Sabbath day, and Jesus has just said he's working that day. So let's try to break this down, clarify a little bit. The Sabbath law was given by God to the Jews. They were to do no work on Sabbath. No Jew had an exception to that rule. And Jesus tells the Jews that he had an exception to that rule. He was accepted, or he was the exception. He was at work with his Father on Sabbath. Who do you have to be exempt from the Sabbath day? What was Jesus claiming here? Well, there's no confusion on the part of the Jews as to what Jesus is claiming here. He's claiming to be equal with God, the only one who could work on Sabbath. And I want you to think about this for a second. It might take some time to kind of gather the context to see this clearly. But if you had just observed the miraculous healing of this handicapped man, Jesus' statement should have been a pretty compelling line of evidence. So what do I mean by that? If Jesus was blaspheming here, if he was claiming to be God and he wasn't God and he was just some false teacher, lawbreaker, sinner in rebellion to God, he never would have been given the divine power to heal the sick man, to heal the handicapped man, right? God would never have allowed him to do that if he was a blasphemer and was disrespecting not only God, but also the Sabbath day and God's laws. And you've got to think as well that this was no sleight of hand miracle. It wasn't Jesus sliding one over on him. It says that this man had been an invalid for 38 years. Probably everybody in Jerusalem, and I mean everybody in Jerusalem, in 38 years had seen this man at least once in this area. If you, even in our giant cities today, if there was somebody on the street for 38 years, probably everybody in that city would have found them, unless you're one of those hermits who never leaves your neighborhood. But cities were significantly smaller back in this time. And here's a man who had been laying there 38 years. Everybody would have known this man. I don't think there's any question about that. There have been probably thousands of people who could attest to the fact that this man was handicapped, and he wasn't handicapped any longer. So the fact that Jesus had the power to perform this miracle on the Sabbath day and then to claim his equality with God should have been a heads up to the Jews that God agreed with him. God agreed with Jesus, and maybe, just maybe, they should have too. But they don't connect the dots here. And I think that's exactly what happens when somebody is more motivated by personal motives than they are rational thinking and having a mind open to learning. Here's a man who's performing miracles. They should at least have their mind cracked a tiny bit to say maybe there's something that we could learn from this guy. And it is just totally closed off. Cannot put the dots together. And they accuse Jesus of all kinds of things and blasphemy. And yet he's still walking around using the power of God. Their accusation doesn't make any sense. And yet they're sticking with it. And just a side note here, oftentimes we go to a verse like John chapter 5, verse 18, to show and to prove Jesus's equality with God. Maybe we're talking to a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon or a Muslim, and we say, look, Jesus claimed to be equal with God, and the Jews understood him to be claiming that. That's good. A lot of times we only have a few minutes to talk to people like that and a few verses that we can reference. But if you have the time, if you gather all of this context together and you really put together the argument that Jesus is making and the fact that he's working miracles, claiming these things, and God is confirming his claims, you actually have a much more robust and I think stronger argument when you put all of this together than you do just citing that verse. So just a thought there. If you have time to sit down with somebody and go over this whole section, you can have a really solid argument for the deity of Jesus. Now, Jesus is going to spend quite a bit of time talking in the second half of this chapter, and we'll get into that in the next video. Just want to thank everybody for their time. And there was a few people. There was somebody who sent me a really nice message. Tyler T. You know who you are. He sent me a message on the website that was really encouraging. Thank you for that. And I always appreciate it when I'm not getting hate comments on YouTube and someone says something nice. So thank you. And thanks everybody who's been watching. Remember, grab the notes, grab the ebook. We'll be back in a few days talking about the second half of this chapter. All right.